Hey everybody, welcome to Greek 1. This is for Monday, September 25th. We are going to cover the Chapter 6 homework translation assignment beginning on page 81 in your textbook. And then after that, I'll go over the notes for Chapter 7. So if you want to go ahead and turn to page 81 in your textbook, we will do that. We'll do that first, and then we'll head over to Chapter 7. So, starting on page 81, translation assignment, the story is entitled The Supper for the Beloved Son, to Deipnon huper tu agape tu huiou. So, like I've done the last couple of weeks, I won't go through the entire translation. I'll just hit some things that I think might be troubling for you, or I'll point out some things that are relatively new in what we've done. And so, I'll try to make sure that I list the sentences that we're going to be covering. So, beginning in paragraph 1, Sentence 1, the sentence that begins, there in akanais tais hemerais, metatone therismon. So that first clause there, that's a prepositional phrase, in akanais tais hemerais. This word akanais here is the far demonstrative pronoun. And there's a couple of things about it. First, it is what we call governed by the preposition. And the preposition in takes the dative case, and so that's why akanais tais hemerais. Each of those occurs in the dative case. Now, the preposition in gives its case to the pronoun akanais, the article tais, and the noun hemerais. But the number plural and the gender feminine are given to akanais by the noun hemeros. Hemerais, which is hemera, it's a feminine noun of the first declension. And so that phrase is translated in those days, and then meta, followed by the accusative case, means after. And so in those days, after the harvest. Note also the very next phrase, an articular phrase, ho pistos didaskalos. That pattern is article, adjective, noun. Remember, that's the attributive pattern. And so that would be translated the faithful teacher. So a couple of things that we've talked about recently. I know articles and adjectives and where they fall in relation to the article can be occasionally tricky. Just remember those patterns that I've taught you, and you can find in your notes and in your textbook as well. Moving on to the second line, most everything there is stuff that we've already seen. But then we get to the verb didasken. Notice a couple of elements about this. You have what is obviously a verb, and it begins with an epsilon. I've been training you, I try to train you to recognize whenever a verb begins with an epsilon or an eta, which we'll see at the beginning of paragraph 2. Ask yourself, is this some kind of past tense verb? Now, so far, the only past tense verbs we've learned have been the imperfect tense. We'll also get to what's called the aorist tense in either next chapter or the chapter after that. But didasken is the verb question here. Let's act as if this is an imperfect verb, and we'll see what we can find. All right, so we've got the epsilon there. All right, let's assume that that's an augment. Then we have a verb stem, didask. Well, does that sound like any verbs you already know? It should, because of the verb didasko. Then you have the epsilon new ending. Well, that looks like a third-person singular ending in the imperfect tense, and you'd be correct. So with just these three elements, augment, verb stem, and personal ending, you can recognize that a didasken is imperfect active indicative third singular. I wanted to point that out because we learned the imperfect this week. Take a look at sentence 2, the sentence beginning tote. Tote into auto topo. Now remember, when you have an article followed by a form of autos, followed by a noun that it is very obviously modifying because it agrees in gender, number, and case, which is the case here, to, auto, topo. These all have the same gender, number, and case. Masculine, singular, dative. The pattern, article, form of autos, and noun is also the attributive pattern of the use of autos, and it means the same, in this particular instance, in the same place. The very next thing we have is another imperfect tense verb. Now you might ask, all right, now how can we know that this is an imperfect tense verb? Well, a couple of things show us. We don't have a verb. We don't have it beginning with an epsilon or an eta. However, remember what I've said, that when you have a compound verb, so a verb that has a prefixed preposition like, pros erchomai, or paralambano, or imbino, or sunago, that the augment does not attach to the very beginning of the verb. The augment always attaches to the beginning of the verb stem. Sometimes the verb stem is, 2, 3, or even 4 letters into the word because of the presence of the prefixed preposition. That's precisely what we've got here. So the verb ago is the stem, and it has the prefixed preposition soon. Remember, in the notes, when you have a verb that begins with a vowel, like an alpha or an epsilon, the augment, which is typically an epsilon, will come on that vowel and it will change it in relatively predictable ways. Usually, an alpha or an epsilon, when they are augmented, will become eta, and that's precisely what we have here. And so the verb sunago in the imperfect active indicative is suneg, and then you have the personal ending after that, which here is third singular. So sunagen is imperfect active indicative, third singular. So far in that sentence, it says, then in the same place, he was gathering, or he was gathering together. And the object is, there in the accusative case, tous mathetas autou, the disciples of him, if you want to do that literally, or it's just as good English, if not better English, to say his disciples, his disciples. Now, I have asked you to make sure that you translate articles, but there's sometimes when English convention will just not let you do that, and this is one of those cases where if you wanted to say the disciples of him, you could. It's a little wordy and not as smooth English as simply saying his disciples. Well, the very next verb is elegan, elegan. And again, we have the same kinds of elements. We have an augment, you have the verb stem from lego, and then you have the third person singular ending, epsilon nu. And so elegan and didasken and sunagen are all imperfect active indicative third singular. Take a look at paragraph 2, the very second word in there, ekuon, ekuon. I mentioned earlier that we have some recognizable patterns when verbs that begin with vowels are augmented. This is the verb akuo. All right, now, how could you recognize that? Okay, well, again, begin training yourself that whenever you see something that looks like it's a verb and it begins with an epsilon or an eta, or in some cases an omega, ask yourself, all right, could this be some past tense verb, whether an imperfect or aorist? Like I said earlier, in our cases, all we've done so far is imperfect tense verbs, and so that's actually that's precisely what we've got here. The augment it changes the alpha of akuo into an eta, and then you have the omicron nu personal ending. Now, in the imperfect active indicative, the omicron nu personal ending is the ending for the first singular and also the ending for the third plural. So the question arises, who is the subject here in this sentence? Footnote 44 is helpful, so check that out, where proton there is, the form is, like your book says, technically it's neuter singular accusative. However, sometimes accusative forms of adjectives end up being used as adverbs, and that's what we have here. So proton here means something like in the first place, And then you have to ask yourself the question, okay, is this first singular ekuon or is this third plural ekuon? If you were to translate this as, in the first place, I was hearing the instruction of the teacher concerning the grass of the field and concerning the fruit of the harvest, that would seem kind of odd given the context, because we haven't introduced any first-person singular subjects, but we have, however, introduced some third-person singular, a group of third-person plurals, where it's his disciples. So I think this makes more sense to translate ekuon here as a third-person plural. So this would be imperfect active indicative, third-person plural. You can move on down to the second sentence, where begin, again, beginning with elegin, which is also another imperfect active indicative verb. We see a new verb, endue, God clothes the grass. And then we see a dative, feminine singular dative, doxe there. This is another way that the dative case gets used, where it can show the manner in which something is done, or this could simply be another use of what's called the instrumental dative, the means by which something is done. I think the manner in which this is clothed, the grass is clothed, makes more sense. So this is called dative of manner. We're gradually learning that the dative case is a little bit more flexible than just indirect object or just instrument. But those are the first two categories we have to learn, because we need to get some footing and get some foundation for the uses of the cases, particularly the dative case. So he was saying, so beginning with the sentence, he was saying that God clothes the grass in glory or with glory, and that karpoi pharontai entois agrois huper tu lau into kosmu. Pharontai there is a form that you should recognize, even though I don't know that we've seen it just yet in our translation sentences. The lexical form is pharaoh, I bring or I carry, and that ontai ending is a passive ending. So this would be present passive indicative, third plural. Fruits are being carried, or fruits are carried in the fields for the people in the world. So that's how you would translate that. There are some other imperfect tense verbs in this sentence, but take a look at the phrase right after, or rather right before footnote 45, the hoti clause there. Hote fulase ho poimen alta, apo ton kakon therion to agru. All right, so we'll stop with that. But he's teaching them a parable about sheep, and he says that hopoimen, we haven't learned the word poimen yet. That's a third declension noun, masculine noun of the third declension. And your footnote is helpful there. It means shepherd. It means shepherd. The shepherd guards, remember fulase, it comes from fulasso, I guard. The shepherd guards them. Guards them. Oh, the sheep there is a neuter plural accusative, and this is the neuter plural accusative third person personal pronoun. One thing that John David let me know from one of his last tutoring sessions was that, and based on your homework, is that some of us are having some difficulty remembering how exactly to parse first person personal pronouns and second person personal pronouns and third person personal pronouns. With the first and second person personal pronouns, so like ego and su and the rest of those, you don't need to give me grammatical gender, because those forms do not in themselves indicate anything like grammatical gender. So in place of grammatical gender for something like ego, just give me the number 1 for first person. But it does have, the form ego does have number, meaning singular or plural, and it does have a case, so that's nominative. So for something like ego, I would want you to parse it as 1 SN for first person, singular nominative. Same with the forms of su, in both the singular and plural. However, when we get to the third person personal pronoun, forms of autos, those forms do actually indicate grammatical gender. And so I want you to parse those. Don't give me the number 3. I don't need that information. I want you to tell me whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter, singular or plural, and then what case it's in. Okay? And so in this instance, because it's very clear that auta here is the accusative, it's the direct object of fulase. Auta would be neuter plural accusative, and he guards them from the evil beasts of the field, and so on. So that's what I saw on page 81. If you have comments or questions about that, please feel free to email me or John David. We'll try to get back to you as soon as we can, even though we're going to be out of town. Turn with me to page 82. There were a couple of other things on page 82. Very first sentence there, we'll see this prepositional phrase quite a bit. Meta tauta. That phrase occurs a lot in the New Testament, particularly in narrative sections where you get a story like this, like what we see in the Gospels and Acts. And so meta tauta here is the way of saying after these things. After these things. Meta, followed by the accusative, remember, is translated after. Tauta is neuter plural accusative. Neuter plural accusative. So after these things, and then we see another imperfect active indicative, third singular of sunago. We can go down just a little bit further and we see exeplacito. And you remember the lexical form of this is ekplesomai. So, with a verb like ekplesomai, we can recognize that ek as a prefixed preposition. Therefore, when it occurs in some kind of past tense, whether in the imperfect or the aorist, we will know that the augment will land not on the front of the verb, meaning the front of the prefix preposition, but it will land on the front of the verb stem, sliding in between the verb stem and the prefix preposition. Now, when that happens with certain prepositions, sometimes those letters will change slightly. The last letter or letters of the prefixed preposition will change slightly when you have the introduction of an augment between those. And that's precisely what's happened here with exeplacito. This is an imperfect passive indicative, third singular. Imperfect passive indicative, third singular. He was amazed. He was amazed. The epsilon augment attaches to the beginning of the stem, plesomai, and the kappa of the prefixed preposition ek becomes an exe. And this, we should recognize this elsewhere when we have seen ek and how it occasionally appears as x. But that's what's happening here. Take a look at footnote 47, so 2 lines below that, right near the middle of the line. They're in the village of Judah or Judea. I don't remember how the back of your book translates that. But here we have the form Achan. Footnote 47 gives you some information about this. This is a very unusual case of the formation of the imperfect tense. Almost always, there is no change in the verb stem. There's no change in how the actual stem is formed in the imperfect tense. And usually, there is relatively little change in how the augment occurs. Usually, it's just an epsilon, or if it lands on the front of a verb stem that begins with a vowel, like alpha or epsilon, it'll become an eta. However, this is just a peculiar instance where the epsilon of echo has become epsilon iota when it receives an augment. I have looked this up before in the past, and I was not able to find anything very helpful for understanding why this is the case. So Right now, all I can tell you is I know that this happens. I can't think of any other examples off the top of my head where this particular change occurs in the imperfect tense. But for now, we can just chalk this one up to say it is what we would call an irregular imperfect. An irregular imperfect. But even still, we can recognize, once we learn that, okay, this echoes irregular, we recognize that epsilon Bnew ending is another third person singular. Third person singular. So Aiken here is perfect active indicative, third singular. Notice on the very next sentence, parlambanim from parlambano. Once again, the epsilon augment has come in between the prefix preposition para and the verb stem lambano. And with this one, too, we can, with this sentence, rather, we can see something else that we've learned recently. Another example of the demonstrative pronoun, in this case, the near demonstrative pronoun. So that sentence, kai pare lambanen hutos o huios para tes psukes tu patros tu agapein, kai doxan, etc. So, and this son, hutos ho huios. Now remember, I mentioned in the notes last week, I remember that hutos ho huios, this is typically the pattern, this is the pattern, or one of the patterns when you use the demonstrative pronoun. Often the authors will say, this the thing, or, those the days, or in those the days, or something like that, or this the man. Greek will often use the article with the demonstrative pronoun. That's the Greek convention. However, in English translation, it would feel really odd and stuffy to translate the article. So in this case, don't translate the article into English. Just know that it is there in Greek, and that's part of the Greek convention. But the sentence, and this son was receiving from the life of his father, or the soul of his father, or something along those lines. Agapein kai doxan, love and glory. Love and glory. And the agapein and doxan are both feminine singular accusative, and the reason why they're accusative is because they are the direct object of the verb parlambano. You have to go quite a ways to get over to the direct object, but hutos ho huios is the subject, this son, and then parates psuches tu patros is a prepositional phrase, and then autu is simply masculine singular genitive. Masculine singular genitive. So again, you could translate this as from the soul or life of the father of him, but that would be really wordy and unnecessary. You could simply say, from, etc., his father. From his father. A lot of times, autu, when it's used like this, is simple possessive use of the genitive. And so that's what we've got here. Now you might take a look at footnote 48 there, patros there. You might be surprised to know that that's in the genitive case. I have warned you all about those nasty boogers, third declension nouns. They are coming, and we'll stand up to them, and we won't let them beat us up, okay? But third declension nouns are weird. The third declension has an extraordinary amount of variation in it, but within every clump of nouns that's thrown into the third declension, there are little smaller units, little smaller collections of similar nouns that have similar patterns of endings. So if the second declension has relatively little variation, and the first declension has a little bit more variation, the third declension has an extraordinary amount of variation, and we will deal with that when we get to it, okay? Okay, something else I wanted you to look at is in the middle of the second paragraph on page 82, in the sentence that begins with meta tuto iduantai himatia kathara. I mentioned earlier last week that in your vocabulary list you have two forms of this this verb in duo. You have the true active form in duo, and then you have a form in duo my that uses those middle passive endings. What I told you last week is that in duo is a true active. So I dress, which we saw earlier in paragraph 2. I dress or I clothe. And within duontai, I told you that it is it could either be a true middle or it could be a passive. With this sentence, metatuto duontai himati akathara. The subject here is the sinners from the second sentence, and so the sinners are putting on pure clothes or clean clothes. And so in duontai here is probably best parsed as present middle indicative third plural. Present middle indicative third plural. Okay, let's take a look at page 83, the very last sentence in the translation. I just wanted to point out that we have another case of a compound verb where the prefixed preposition changes slightly with the introduction of the augment. And so, inebainen, your book gives you a helpful footnote. This is from the verb embino, which means to get on, or in the sense of like embark, get onto a boat. When you have the augment introduced onto the verb stem, the mu of the prefixed preposition will become a nu, like the preposition in. Okay, and footnote 53 there gives you a helpful discussion of when that change occurs before particular kinds of consonants, and those are called labial consonants because they're formed on the lips. And so pi, phi, and beta, if you say those and you're conscious of how they're formed in your mouth, you will recognize that pi, phi, and beta, each of those are formed, each of those letter sounds are formed using the lips rather than, for example, on the back of the teeth, like lambda or delta or tau, or a guttural consonant like kappa and gamma, and a couple of others that I can't think of off the top of my head right now. But those are three different classifications of Greek consonants, and certain certain consonants will change in predictable ways when they have certain letters next to them in different variations. That will become especially helpful when we get to certain kinds of verbs and things like that. But anyway, we just wanted to draw your attention to that. That's why this form looks strange. We would not call this an irregular, even though it does change slightly. But it's because the stem itself has not changed and the augment has not changed. That's why we wouldn't call it an irregular. Unlike what we saw earlier on page 82, near the top there with Aiken. Okay, so those are the things that I thought you might need some help with in your homework. As always, feel free to email me or John David and ask us any questions that you might have. If you will go ahead and turn to page 84, I will run through the vocabulary with you, and then make sure you grab the Chapter 7 notes, and I will introduce those to you as well. Hey everybody, welcome back from break. Turn to page 84, beginning of Chapter 7 in your textbook. I'll go through the words with you, and then after that we'll take a look at the notes, okay? So starting on page 84, number 1, alelon. This means one another, and this is something that we'll look at when we actually get to the grammar of Chapter 7. Number 2, dendron. Dendron is a neuter noun of the second declension, and it means tree. Number 3, heautu, means himself. Notice that this only occurs with genitive, dative, and accusative endings. This is a reflexive pronoun, and like I said, we'll like with alelon, we'll get to that here in just a little bit. Number 4, amau2, also occurring with just genitive, dative, and accusative endings. It means myself. This is the first person reflexive pronoun. Notice number 3, heiautu, with a rough breathing mark, is translated himself. That's the third person reflexive pronoun. Number 5, Jesus. Jesus is the nominative form, and u Jesu there, the u ending Jesu, is both the genitive and the dative, as well as the vocative form. And the accusative form is Jesun, and this means Jesus. Number 6, kainos. This is an adjective of 3 terminations, so it has the kinds of endings that we would expect from the masculine second declension, pure eta of the first declension, and neuter of the second declension. It means new. When the New Testament talks of the new covenant, this is the word that is often used for the new covenant, kainos. Number 7, kephale, feminine noun of the first declension. It means head. Number 8, keruso, is a verb. It means I preach or proclaim. If any of you went to Harding University for undergrad fairly recently, you might be familiar with the project that Devin Swindle's been running for the last few years, the keruso experience. That word, keruso, there comes from this Greek verb, which means I preach or proclaim. Number 9, klados, masculine noun of the second declension. It means branch. Number 10, kline, feminine noun of the first declension. It means bed. You can see where we get our words incline or a clinic from this word. Number 11, kradzo, means I cry out or I shout. Number 12, kruptos, an adjective of 3 terminations. It means hidden or secret, and we get our word cryptic from that. Remember, when you have a Greek upsilon and you want to transliterate it into English, almost always that becomes a Y in English, unless it's in a diphthong, in which case it will be translated with the letter U. All right, number 13, lithos. Lithos. It's a masculine noun of the second declension. It means stone. And if you're familiar with like the Paleolithic era, or if you're familiar with the term monolith, I mean, those all refer to stone. Number 14, nestuo. Nestuo means I fast. Number 15, nosos. Nosos. This is a feminine noun of the second declension. I think we've seen hodos before, which is also a feminine noun of the second declension, and so the endings will look masculine, but this is actually a feminine, grammatically feminine word. It means disease or sickness. Number 16 is a verb, horao. Note the rough breathing mark on the omicron, horao, means I see. And if you notice that word panorama there, panorama, the prefix there, pan, is a Greek word. It means all. So if you have ever heard the word pandemic at any point in the last 3 years, pan means all. Number 17, hote. Hote. It means when. When. Number 18, upo. Upo means not yet. Number 19, hutos. Hutos, it means thus or in this way. Also notice that this sounds the same as the near demonstrative pronoun hutos, but these are totally different words, okay? All right, number 20, palaios. Palaios. Another adjective of 3 terminations, has distinct masculine, feminine, and neuter endings, and it means old. Old. Number 21, petenon. Petenon. It's a neuter noun of the second declension, and it means bird. And your book says that we get our word pet from that. That surprises me, but if that helps you remember to remind you of the word pet, then go for it. Number 22, this is the second person reflexive pronoun, seiautu. Seiautu. Notice also the reflexive pronouns only end in genitive, dative, and accusative endings. Number 23, stratiotes. Stratiotes. This is a masculine noun of the first declension, which is why it has that eta sigma ending. Kind of unusual, but similar to prophetes and mathetes. And this word means soldier. Number 24, sunerkomai, I come together. I come together. Remember, sunerkomai and all the forms of erkomai in the present tense are deponent, which means they have middle passive endings, but they function like an active verb, okay, where the subject is doing the action. So the middle passive endings, but active in meaning, that's called deponent. I'll parse that with a D, okay? Last two, number 25, telones. Telones. Masculine noun of the first declension, it means tax collector. Tax collector. And lastly, number 26, phaneros. Phaneros. Another adjective of three terminations, and it means visible or manifest. The second part of the Greek compound word theophany comes from phaneros. Say, well, what is a theophany? Occurs quite a bit in the Old Testament. Theophany is an appearance of God, most notably in Exodus, right? But a theophany is an appearance of God. And so that P-H-A-N ending there comes from this adjective, phaneros. Okay, go ahead and grab the Chapter 7 notes from Canvas. Those will be in the Chapter 7 module. And if you want to follow along in your textbook, you can. We're beginning on page 85. Chapter 7 introduces the future tense of verbs and a few different types of pronouns, really just two different types of pronouns, which we have seen in our textbook already on page 84 in the vocabulary list. Those types of pronouns are reflexive pronouns and reciprocal pronouns. Reciprocal pronouns are really easy. Reflexive pronouns, there's a lot of forms, but they follow patterns that we've already learned. And so that's one thing that I have always tried to insist on. You memorize, recognize those patterns, memorize those, and that will really help you whenever you come up with new stuff, okay? So let's stay on page 85, or let's be on page 85, but I'll be following the notes more closely. So chapter 7 introduces the future tense of verbs. Obviously, future tense portrays action that is happening or that will happen in the future. Compare this with the imperfect tense, which we learned recently, normally portrays ongoing action in the past. Here's a nice helpful key for memorizing the future tense. If you already have the present active indicative and the present middle passive indicative endings memorized, that omega pattern or the oh my pattern, if you already have those memorized, you basically have the future tense memorized as well. Here's the difference. The future tense is formed by adding a sigma between the verb stem and the personal endings. Remember, the personal endings are those omega patterns or those oh my pattern, okay? So take a look at the charts that I've got here in the middle of the page. The future active indicative of luo is very straightforward. It's very simple. It is lu plus sigma plus the personal endings. And so if it helps you to memorize or to visualize the future tense like that, think about it as having three components. Verb stem, a sigma tense identifier, that's what we call the sigma here, a sigma future tense identifier, and then the personal endings. And so I'll read these for you here. The future active indicative, beginning with the first singular, luso, luces, luce. And then with the first plural, lusomen, lucete, and lususi. And again, the third plural has the movable nu like we've seen throughout the present. Now for the future middle, basically the same process is true. You have the verb stem, you have the sigma future tense identifier, and then you have the oh my pattern endings. However, these forms that you see here in front of us, luso my, etc., those are only for the future middle indicative. The future passive takes a totally different set of forms, which we will not learn until we get to chapter 10. So let's read through the future middle indicatives together. Remember, these are not the future passives. Those are totally different forms. But these are only the future middle and future deponent. All right, let's take a look. So number 1, lusomai, luce, and lucetai. So those were the singular. Now with the plural. Lusomatha, luceste, and lusantai. So again, please note that the future middle indicative and the future passive indicative endings, those are two completely different forms, sets of forms. And the future middle indicative forms also serve as the future tense for deponent verbs. So that same pattern, right? Usually, if your verb is deponent in the present tense, it's probably going to be deponent in the future tense as well. Now, there are some oddities, which we'll get to on the second page of the Chapter 7 notes, but I wanted you to take a look at some of how this looks with a few examples here at the bottom of the page. Akusomen, so look at that and kind of break it down into its parts, right? Aku is the verb stem. We have the sigma, future tense identifier, and we have the omen ending. Well, that's the first person plural ending. And so we would parse akusomen, for example, future active indicative, first plural. Now, akusomen, as a future active indicative first plural, means we will hear. We will hear. You can do that process with the rest of these too. So therapiususen, so you see that therapiu, verb stem, the sigma, tense identifier, and then the third person plural personal ending, usen. So therapiususen, they will heal. Future active indicative, third plural. And I can let you work out the rest of those as well. Okay? All right. Let's take a look at page 2 of the Chapter 7 notes. And if you want to follow along in your textbook, pages 88 and 89. Now, when you add a sigma to the verb stem, to the end of the verb stem, in order to form the future tense, sometimes certain consonants will change. Now, this type of change is what's known as a morphological change, or a change in the form, a change in the spelling. All of those refer to the same process. A morphological change is a change in the way it's spelled. Okay? Thankfully, even though there is some variation here, thankfully these changes occur in regular patterns. Now, there are 3 groups of consonants that are affected when you add a sigma to the end of the verb stem. And I mentioned this before the break. So with consonants that are called labial consonants, those are consonants that are formed with the lips. Pi, phi, and beta, when you add a sigma immediately after those, so like pi sigma or phi sigma or beta sigma, those consonants actually change and they become the letter psi. The letter psi. So for example, if you have blepo in the present, when you add a sigma there at the end of the verb stem, in between the pi and the omega personal ending, the form becomes blepso. And it's not spelled with the pi sigma, it's spelled with a psi. Okay? Similar to grapho. If you have grapho and you add a sigma to say, I will write, you add a sigma there in between the verb stem, which ends in phi, and you have, and it's in between the omega of the personal ending. That form becomes gropso, future active indicative, first singular, I will write, gropso. So this occurs with basically any verb that, where the stem ends in one of these labial consonants. That final consonant of the stem will become a psi. Now, another set of consonants is called the guttural consonants, also known as palatal consonants, because they're formed in the back of the throat in the palate. These consonants are kappa, gamma, chi, and double sigma, which is not really it's not really a guttural consonant, but it follows the same pattern as kappa, gamma, and chi, and so that's why it's included here. So let's say you have a verb like dioko in the present tense. If you want to, which means like I pursue or I persecute, if you want to change it to a future tense, you add your sigma tense identifier in between the stem and the personal ending, but you get this morphological change where the kappa plus sigma equals exi. And so you have the form dioxo, dioxo. Similarly with ago, which becomes oxo, and fulasso, that double sigma, which actually becomes fulaxo. I guess Greeks didn't like three sigmas together. I don't know. But anyway, fulasso becomes fulaxo. Fulaxo. So I will keep or I will guard. The last group of consonants is the dental consonants. Those are formed on the back of the teeth. Delta, theta, zeta. As you say those, you pay attention like how you actually physiologically form those as you say them. And you can tell delta, theta, and zeta, your tongue is either on your teeth or right behind your teeth. And so that's why they're called, that's why those are called the dental consonants. And so if you have a present tense form like baptizo, where the stem ends in a zeta, when you add a sigma to that form, actually, that combination of letters becomes a sigma. And so baptizo in the present becomes baptizo in the future. Same with patho in the present. Patho becomes peso in the future. And finally, doxazo, that ends in a zeta, also becomes doxaso, just like baptizo. Now these are changes that we will simply have to memorize, but as we continue to use them, as we continue to read Greek, we'll recognize these more and more quickly. These kinds of changes will also occur in the next past tense form that we're going to learn. I think it may be here in the next chapter or two, which is called the aorist tense. But those patterns are a little bit more recognizable, and we'll get to all that when we get to it. But these patterns are fairly clear. We can see. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? If you had a sigma next to certain letters, it makes the sound that those letters change into. That's pretty straightforward. However, if you look at the middle of the page 2 of the notes, you'll notice that Chapter 7 introduces 6 different verbs that have an irregular future tense form. And so I've put those here below, starting with anabino. Anabino is the present tense form, but its future tense form is what we would call irregular, and it's anabasomai. So that would be a future deponent indicative. Why is it deponent? Because it has these middle endings, but it is active in meaning. The subject is the one doing the action. By the way, all of these are deponent. All these irregulars are deponent. I don't know if every irregular future is deponent, but all the ones that I can think of are. And there's some others on here that we will get to later. But yeah, all of these are deponent. So keep that in mind too, that if you see one of these weird irregular futures, just go ahead and know that that is deponent. So with the second one, gnosko, the future deponent indicative form, the future form of gnosko is nosomai, nosomai. With erkomai, the future form is elusomai. And again, these are all future deponent indicative. With estheo, the form is phagomai, phagomai. With lambano, the future form is lampsomai, lampsomai. And lastly, with horao, notice the rough breathing mark over the omicron. Horao's future form is opsomai, opsomai. Now, I mentioned here in the notes that there's a pretty complex history behind each of these, how each of these present tense forms became their irregular future forms. A couple of things I think are at play here. I'm not going to quiz you on this, but I think it's helpful for you to know, because as you're looking at this, you might think, man, that's just weird, and it doesn't make sense. Well, first off, languages are weird, because they're alive and they're always changing. English changes pretty noticeably, even across just a few decades. So, with forms like Onabino and Gnosko, I think what has happened is that thousands of years ago, right, you had Greek speakers in one part of Greece and Greek speakers in another part of Greece, and they're all speaking Greek, but they're speaking essentially what we would know as different dialects. As peoples migrate, as literature grows, as the literature and diplomacy of a particular area begins to take sway and predominate over other areas, the languages also mix and intermingle, and one language tends to come to prominence over the other. An example from not really modern history, but closer than ancient Greece. Take something like medieval England, for example. The country of England, not a very large country, you had all kinds of different dialects of English. However, with the popularity of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, that particular dialect of English began to predominate, and actually sort of artificially bumped up its influence on the rest of how English was spoken throughout the rest of England. So a similar kind of concept was likely at play here in ancient Greece, where with something like Onabino and Onabasomai, where these forms, particularly the root forms there, Bino and Basomai, those might have been related at some point, dialectically, with very peculiar differences like Erkomai to Elusomai and Estheo to Phagomai. I think what has happened there is a feature that we actually recognize in English, even though we don't know that we know it. You have one totally different word used for maybe a particular tense, and then you have another totally different word used for a different tense, and somehow through the oddities, peculiarities of history, those two have kind of come to function as the present tense and the future tense of the same concept. We see this in English with something like the word go. Go is present tense. Will go is future tense. Went is past tense. Well, how did we get there? Well, I think what happened was that there were ultimately two different verbs that, gradually through use became connected because they had similar concepts and were just used somewhat interchangeably. One form fell out of favor while the other form rose to prominence, and that's what has happened. So I think this is what's happened with Estheo and Phagomai as well. So anyway, I've got a footnote there to Bill Mounce's Morphology of Biblical Greek. That's a very dense and technical resource. I've tried really hard to make good use of that, and only sometimes have I found it helpful. I'll admit that I have kind of an amateur's training in morphology, but someone who would be able to give you some guidance if you're interested in this kind of stuff is Dr. Kevin Youngblood over in the Bible department in Searcy. So anyway, lastly, for the future tense, let's take a look at the future indicative forms of a me. They're here at the bottom of page 2 in the notes, or page 93 in the textbook if you want to follow along. Look at a me and recognize that we've got a few different things here. We have the stem, which has, in the future tense, has been whittled all the way down to just an epsilon. But we also have the sigma future tense identifier, and we have the recognizable OMI pattern endings. And so if you have all of those elements, if you can remember all of those elements, then you're good to go. And so let's say these together before we move on to the pronouns here in just a second. Starting with the first singular, asomai, ese, estai, and the first plural, esomatha, esesthe, and asontai. Now remember, with the forms of a me, some grammarians do not include voice. Other grammarians do include voice. Here at HST, we don't. We historically do not include voice, and so these are just future indicative of a me. If at some point you do you come across somebody who includes voice, it'll be in the active voice. Okay? All right, let's take a look at pages 3 and 4 of the Chapter 7 notes. We're also on page 97 in your textbook if you want to follow along. And reflexive pronouns refer specifically to some previously mentioned subject, be the previously mentioned or a previously implied subject. Now, they differ from the emphatic use of autos, which, if you remember the pattern, ego autos, for example, would mean something like I, myself. Reflexive pronouns differ from this use of autos in both form, meaning how they look, and function, how they actually operate. Let's take a look at the example at the bottom of page 94. Ego doxazo e mauton, that's the first example there. Ego doxazo e mauton is translated, I glorify myself. Now, the reflexive pronoun in this short little phrase here, short little clause, is e mauton. That's the reflexive pronoun. It is the first person reflexive pronoun, and it's also masculine singular accusative. Remember earlier when I was talking through the vocabulary with you, I mentioned the reflexive pronouns have endings like we've already seen with the declensions that we've studied so far. So, ego doxazo e mauton means I glorify myself. The first person, masculine singular accusative reflexive pronoun, e mauton, refers to the previously mentioned subject of doxazo, which is ego. So we can take a look at some other examples here in the notes. Take a look at the second bullet point there from Matthew chapter 8, verse 9. Kaigar ego anthropos me hupo exousian echon hup emauton stratiotas. Where this is the this is the noble centurion talking to Jesus, and he says, "For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under myself." And you can see there, emauton is also masculine singular accusative. Another example of this from the Gospel of Matthew is in chapter 4, verse 6, where the devil is tempting Jesus, and he says to him, "Ehuio se tu theou, bale se auton kato." Now notice se auton there is the second person masculine singular accusative reflexive pronoun, where the devil says, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down." Bale se auton kato. Also from Matthew chapter 12, verse 45, Jesus is talking with the Pharisees here, and he's describing what happens when someone is not spiritually filled. He says, "Tote peruatai kai paralambane meth heautu, hepta hetera pneumata ponerotera heautu." Now the reflexive pronouns here, heautu, are both neuter singular genitive. These are both neuter singular genitive. And this sentence is translated, "Then it goes and brings along with itself 7 other spirits more evil than itself." So you can see here in these 3 sentences that the reflexive pronoun occurs in different forms for the first person, the second person, and the third person. But I want you to parse these forms just like you would any other noun or adjective with simple gender, number, and case, okay? Because the forms themselves indicate both gender, number, and case, unlike the regular old personal pronouns like ego, su, and so on. All right, take a look at the forms here, the colored charts. The first person forms are divided up into singular and plural. Second person forms are divided up into singular and plural. Third person forms are also divided up singular and plural, but with the third person there we have the introduction of forms for the neuter grammatical gender. First person and second person only have forms within the New Testament for the masculine and feminine. Take a look at the first person singular forms. You have, beginning with the genitive, emautu, emauton, and amaltone. We recognize those endings from the second declension. With the feminine first-person singular forms, we have amaltase, amalte, and amaltane. We should recognize those from the first declension. Now, with the plural forms, there is some differentiation here. The mu of the singular forms drops out, and there's a rough breathing mark on the epsilon. So in the masculine plural genitive, you have heautone, heautois in the dative, and heautus in the accusative. For the feminine forms, they're similar, but there is a slight difference in spelling right near the end there. The feminine plural genitive is heautone, but the feminine plural dative is heautais, borrowing an ending again from feminine nouns of the first declension. And lastly, the feminine plural accusative is heautas. The second person forms begin with sigma in the singular. You might notice that is similar to how the second person personal pronouns begin. So take a look there, the masculine singular genitive in the second person forms, seautu, seauto, and seautone. Very similar to the first person forms, just with some difference there at the beginning, but the endings are the same. We can say the same of the feminine forms as well, seautes in the feminine singular genitive, seaute, and seautane. Now the plural forms of the second person are the exact same as the plural forms of the first person. So context will help you determine which is which. In the third person, there is some difference where instead of beginning with a smooth breathing mark like the first person, the third person begins with a rough breathing mark, and there's no letter mu like with the first person. So beginning with the third person singular forms, masculine singular genitive, it's heautu, heauto, and heautone. The feminine forms are heautes, heaute, and heautane. Again, you recognize these endings. The neuter forms are heautu, heauto, and heauto. Again, similar to endings that we've seen before. Now, the plural forms are the same in the masculine, and the feminine third-person forms are the same as we've seen up above. There is some difference, though, with the plural neuter forms. Plural neuter in the genitive, heautone, heautois, so the same as the masculine, but then the neuter plural accusative in the third-person reflexive pronoun is heauta. Slightly different there. So those are the forms, and you might be able to recognize if you look back at the top at the bullet points that I have there. You'll begin to see how each of those forms actually fit and make sense within their sentences. All right, let's take a look at page 96 of your textbook. This is an example here from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5. It reads, Ugar heautus kerusimen ala Christon Iesun kurion, heautus dedulus humon dia Iesun. Translated, that is, for we do not preach ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord. And we preach ourselves as your servants on account of Jesus. Now, the plural forms are pretty similar. Plural forms of reflexive pronoun are pretty similar. So we have to look at the context to determine how to translate heautus. In this sentence, the subject is we, kerusomen, which is present active, indicative, first person plural of keruso. So heautus in this example, in this sentence, is translated ourselves. Let's just say, for example, that the sentence were changed a little bit, and the subject were second plural. So instead of kerusomen, we had kerusete. Well, then the sentence could read this way, Ugar heautus kerusete, for you do not preach yourselves. Again, context will determine how you translate the plural of reflexive pronouns. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that reflexive pronouns differ from the emphatic and intensive uses of the pronoun autos. So in the middle of the page, in the middle of page 4 in the notes, I've got some examples for you. If you had the phrase autos ego keruso, that would be translated, I myself preach. Here the pronoun autos is being used emphatically and is one way to place the emphasis on I. But if you were to have, in the second bullet point, autos ho didaskalos, the teacher himself, here the pronoun autos is being used intensively where the emphasis is placed on teacher. But this is not true with the reflexive pronoun. Take a look at the third bullet point there in the middle, ego keruso e mauton. That is, I preach myself, where myself is, in this hypothetical scenario, the object of the preaching. So it's not the third person personal pronoun. E mauton is the first person masculine singular accusative reflexive pronoun. The reflexive pronoun in this example is in the accusative case. It's the case of the direct object. And so that means that e mauton is the object of the verb keruso. And so I preach myself. In other words, what I am preaching to you is myself. The last kind of pronoun that we're going to learn in this chapter is at the bottom of page 4. It's called reciprocal pronouns. Reciprocal pronouns. And it's at the top of page 96 in your textbook if you want to follow along. Reciprocal pronouns are basically translated to, as each other or one another, and they're pretty common throughout the New Testament. They occur in 3 different cases, the genitive, dative, and accusative cases. So the genitive form is allelon, and that is how it's going to look. The case there does not change, the form does not change based on the gender. I'll tell you why in just a second. So James chapter 4, verse 11, for example, me katalalete allelon adelphoi. Do not speak evil of one another, brothers. The dative form is allelois. You can find that in Galatians chapter 5, verse 3. Aladetes agapes duluete allelois. But through love, serve one another. The accusative form is allelus. And this occurs in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32. Geneste de eis allelus, Christoi, where he says, be kind to one another. Now, these forms occur about 100 times in the New Testament, and only 3 instances are grammatically neuter. The other 97 forms are masculine. Other 97 occurrences are masculine. And they are all plural, by the way. So you can almost always assume that these forms are going to be masculine, and they're parsed just like you would parse any other noun, okay, with gender, number, and case. For you, though, this will be pretty easy because they're almost always going to be masculine. They will always be plural, and the only thing you have to do to recognize the case is just look at the ending, whether it's the Bnew ending, which is typical of the genitive plural, the omicron iota sigma, which is typical of the dative plural, and the omicron upsilon sigma, which is pretty typical of the accusative plural. Well, that's everything from Chapter 7. Let me know if you have any questions, and please email me. I know this is a little different than what we're used to. I would rather do this in person with you. You have no idea how many takes that I have cut through this video to try to make sure that everything was nice and smooth. It's much easier to actually teach in person, even if you consider Zoom on person, than to teach just to a camera. But email me, Aaron John David, if you have any questions. And don't forget, on your midterm will only cover chapters 1 through 6. The reason why we had to go over chapter 7 today was so that we can get to it after your midterm. So, blessings on your midterm. Hope you all do well. Be praying for you. And we will see you in a couple weeks, okay? All right, bye-bye.